I decided to look at climate through the lenses of a development economist. And given my experience in international organization, I was very naturally oriented toward talking about the transfers that are taking place between rich countries and poor countries, or between developed and developing countries in the world. A transfer that we call official development assistance. Official development assistance is meant to help developing countries to reduce poverty, hopefully to eradicate poverty in some horizon. This is probably the most important tool that does exist at the global level to help development. Now we have another element that we want to take into account in terms of north-south transfers, which is climate finance. There is a need for all countries in the world to reduce emissions. There is a need for mitigation. This need does exist in developing countries too. CO2 emissions is a public good, and everybody is concerned with this public good. And this means that in order for developing countries to participate to the global effort, developed countries need to help. And this is the function or the goal of climate finance. And recently, it has been decided, recently a couple of years ago, in 2009, as a matter of fact, it was decided that developed countries would be financing climate policies in developing countries for an amount which was set to $100 billion a year, starting in 2020 and until 2030, and probably more after 2030. What I want to talk about today is what the title that you have in front of you, which is what is the way to combine official development assistance the old way, helping development, and on the other hand, climate finance, that is helping countries to control or to reduce emissions and possibly to adapt to climate changes. So this is the topic. Okay, this is to get an idea about the amount of money or the resources involved. Okay, I started with this well-known citation of Jacques Chirac about our house is burning down, and we are blind to it. My point is that today we are not blind anymore. This is good, but we are absolutely overwhelmed by what it takes to not even to extinguish the fire, but to attenuate the fire. And here you have an idea about the orders of magnitude. They are very rough orders of magnitude, but we estimate today that in order to reach the Paris Agreement goals, we need, at the global level, more or less 8 trillion a year, $8,000 billion. And if we look only at the developing countries to the south, excluding China, then the estimate is between 1.2 and $2.4 trillion. Which is something like between 6 and 12% of the GDP of developing countries. This is enormous. Now, of course, the global north is responsible to a large extent of the global warming today, of emission today, and given also the public good aspect of mitigation, there is a strong argument for the north to be footing the bill, to be paying for this effort to be made by developing countries who would not afford to do it on their, which would not afford to do it on their own resources. And this comes on top of official development assistance and some other north-south flows. So this is what I want to look at now is where do we stand on that agenda, and what can we learn from the long experience that we acquired in the past with official development assistance. Because climate finance may be considered as another aspect of development assistance. And this is what I want to look at. So let me This is the outline of this presentation. I'm not sure that we'll be able to go through all this. Let me start with a few words about official development assistance and the evolving nature of those income transfers. Things started at the end of World War II, and development aid appeared in those days in the 50s and 60s. And we cannot hide the fact that one of the motivations was definitely the Cold War, which was starting. And there was an attempt on both sides of the political game, let's call it in that way. There was an interest in trying to attract as many countries as possible on their side. And official development assistance was one way to do that. We could also consider it was a kind of an extension of the Marshall Plan in Europe, which worked very, very well. And some countries say, okay, why don't we do the same thing for developing countries? And all this motivation was reinforced by the fact that in the 60s, this was a decolonization of many countries in the world. And those countries, again, needed some help to start their new era as independent countries. Very quickly, the system was organized in the OECD, which was the follow-up of the agency responsible for managing the Marshall Plan. In the OECD, a Development Assistance Committee, DAC, was created, which has run, or which has analyzed and monitored this official development assistance over time. Things went well at the beginning, and then after a couple of years in the 60s, it was found that the contribution by developed countries were falling in proportion as a proportion of their GDP, their total income. And because of that, the World Bank in those days asked a report from the former Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson, who made this report, the Pearson Report, which was strong encouragement and, as a matter of fact, a kind of commitment for developed countries to provide to developing countries a share of their total income, gross national income, which would be 0.7% of their total income. The idea being later on to go from 0.7% to 1%. So this was the goal. And we can say that this goal has never been reached. And let me jump or skip all this to show you what actually happened with official development assistance. You have in this chart, the blue curve correspond to the amount of official development assistance in real terms. So this is corrected for inflation, okay? Let's say international inflation, because it is not that easy to make this kind of correction when you look at many countries at the same time. And the orange curve is the same amount, but related to GNI, the gross national income of DAC countries, of developed countries. And the bars that you can see are big events in the history of official development assistance. The first bar on the left is the Pearson Report. And you can see that the Pearson Report comes at a time where the share of ODA over GNI has been going down throughout the 60s. And this is what justified the report. Then we can see on the blue curve that aid, ODA or aid, is increasing with some accident. For example, you have an accident in the end of the 70s, early 80s. This is the second oil price boom, the disinflation in the world. And then we have another increase in ODA, which is quite strong, which corresponds to the debt crisis in developing countries, where, as a matter of fact, more aid was given to help countries to adjust their economy to a new globalized world. And then we have a second bar, which is, in 1990, we have an event which is quite important, which is the end of the communist regime in the Soviet Union. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War is over. And because of that, aid is going down because one of the motivations is disappearing. And then the second big event in this is the Millennium Declaration in 2000, where the United Nations are trying to reinvigorate official development assistance, creating the Millennium Development Goals, which then were transformed into the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can see that aid increased again rather quickly. And then the last important event is COP15, where it was decided, what I was saying earlier, that developed countries would be financing climate policies in developing countries for an amount of $100 billion to be reached by 2020. Then you can see that it takes apparently some time, but after a while we see that the blue curve is increasing. We may believe that this is a result of this decision about climate finance. This is not completely the case because if you make a correction, especially for the last year of 2022, if you take into account the huge amount of money which was transferred to Ukraine because of the war, and the amount of money which was spent on welcoming refugees from Ukraine, then you find something which is not that great. I mean, the dotted line is total ODA minus the amount of money spent on refugees and transfers to Ukraine. It is not the transfer, it is not the military aid, it is only the civil aid. Military aid is not there, and it is a kind of specific topic. So this is where we stand in terms of ODA. It's a long history of ODA, and at the end we have the appearance of this climate finance. So let's look at more carefully to climate finance here. This chart has been published, has been reported by the OECD recently, with the view that they just made the calculation for 2022, and they found that for the first time, the threshold of $100 billion had been passed in 2022. And the total amount of transfers under the heading of climate finance by developed countries had reached the target 2 years later, but it was there. In this chart, you also see the various contributions. The bottom heavy blue part is what is contributed by bilateral development agencies. So every country has a development agency. Germany has one, France has one, the British have one, etc. And this is the amount that they transfer to developing countries in one way or another. Here, presumably, for programs or projects which are aimed at adapting or mitigating the emission of greenhouse gas. The light blue part is what is contributed by the multilateral agencies. In particular, all the multilateral development banks, the World Bank in the first place, but the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, etc. The new banks, the Islamic Bank, the new bank in Asia, or the new bank created by the BRICS, plus all the funds which were created to manage climate finance, like the Green Fund, like the Development Environmental Fund, etc. And, okay, you can see that this has been increasing quite substantially. The purple part is about what is contributed by the private sector, but not the private sector in an autonomous way. It is attributed to the public sector, either the multilateral banks or the bilateral banks, simply because those actors can give to private actors some guarantee on which the private actors may commit some financing. Typically, this is very much in finance, typically the European Investment Bank would be guaranteeing to a small company in Mali some money so that this company in Mali can do some lending to small firms in Mali. So it is typically this kind of, and the idea, of course, is that the money should be used on climate issues. So this is where we stand. Now, the big issue, if you put together this chart and the previous one, then a very important question is appearing. Is this climate finance additional, or is it simply substituted to other spending or other transfers which were made by developed countries? If you look at the previous slide, you remember that at the end there was no big increase in the real amount which was transferred from by the north to the south. So because of that, we may believe, we may expect that the additionality will be limited. From that point of view, there is a big difference between looking at nominal values and looking at real values. I mean, after deflating for price increases. In nominal values, yes, there is an increase. Fine, but this is an increase which is due to inflation. And we should not consider that this is an addition to the amount that was already provided by developed countries. So in order to look at what is going on, this is what I did. On this chart, starting in 2009, we see the total amount of ODA at constant prices. This is the, what you get at the top of those areas. Then I take out the amount which is spent on refugees and transfers to Ukraine. This is the pink part. Then we have the bilateral contribution to climate finance, which is the light blue. And you see that there is a small increase, but not that much. And the blue part at the bottom is what is left in developing countries for other uses than climate. And we see that there is no big change, but if we have to say something about the trend, it is a negative trend. So from that point of view, it has not been an addition, it has been a substitution. And now if we add to that what is happening with multilateral financing, multilateral financing is difficult to take into account for many reasons, because banks are receiving money from developed countries to manage the official development assistance or part of the official development assistance of developed countries. And they use that money to themselves to finance projects in developing countries. What is a bit more difficult is that very much of that money is used to extend loans to developing countries. And then there is an issue about what is the value of a loan in comparison with the value of a grant. Normally, we should try to take into account in a loan, which is provided with concessions, in the sense that the rate of interest is extremely low, the maturity is extremely long, and these are certainly much better loans that could be obtained in the private sector. But we should be comparing grants and loans on the same basis. And disbursement is, to some extent, misleading. On top of that, regional development banks are reporting commitments. They say, oh, we just sign a an agreement with this country according to which we'll be providing in the next 10 years so much to that country. But it is not a disbursement. And we know that in many cases, what is committed is not actually disbursed. So because of that, it's difficult to know exactly what the way in which what the multilateral banks are providing is financed. But normally, they are financing their operations based on the money that is being provided by donor countries to the World Bank and to the African Development Bank. So we can say that what they do can be attributed to the developed countries. And when we do that, and we take that out of total ODA, we find the dotted line that we have here, which now correspond to what is left for other uses than the climate. And now, definitely, the slope is negative, so that we have many reasons to believe that this increase or this contribution to climate finance by developed countries over the last 10 years or so has not been additional, and there is an issue. So now we are in front of the following situation. $100 billion on the one hand is not enough, and at the end of the year, in COP29, there will be an evaluation of what is actually needed by developing countries to finance their climate program. And what we'll find that the order of magnitude will be between 600 billion and 1.2, as I said before, 1.2 trillion. So the order of magnitude is completely different. So this is the first point, that is that developed countries, if they are serious about the mitigation in particular, they have to provide this kind of money. They also have to contribute to adaptation. They have to keep providing aid for development and poverty reduction. And in addition, in COP28, there was a decision to create a fund called Loss and Damages to compensate developing countries for disasters linked to climate. For example, the terrible flood in Pakistan 2 years ago, which made 10,000 or more people died then, would be covered by the loss and damage fund. So these are all the obligations, quote unquote, that the global north will have to face in the coming years. Now let's assume that they agree in doing that. I mean, certainly, but what you can show is that if they do that, if you look at the total amount that would be involved, this would be not very different from 1% of the GDP of developed countries, which, interestingly enough, was the old ideal goal that was mentioned in the Pearson report. So it is not something which is completely abnormal, but it is certainly the case that this would represent an important effort by developed countries. But this is not the only problem. The second problem is, let's assume that the money is available. How can we be sure that the money will be well used by the recipient countries? And from that point of view, and this is the reason why I think it is important to reflect on ODA, we have a long experience with ODA. The issue of the effectiveness of official development assistance in generating development, in reducing poverty, is something which has been analyzed, researched, discussed, debated for many years. And we have reached some kind of system in which there is an allocation of total aid across countries. There are ways donors are able to check or not to check what is going on with the money they give to the developing countries. All this experience will have to be used in climate finance. And where things are becoming a bit more difficult is the following. we have to realize that the issue of sovereign to sovereign transfer means that donors may try to impose some specific use of the money that they gave to a country. They may say, we want so much to be used for mitigation. We want so much to be used for development. We want so much to be used for adaptation. The country, the recipient country, has always the possibility of modifying that. They will be in agreement with the donors. So donors will say, we want you to spend 10 million on this program in agriculture to reduce emission. Then the recipient country can say, okay, fine, we'll do that. But at the same time, I will be reducing the amount I am putting in this program by 10 million. Which means that recipient countries have always the possibility to undo what donors would like them to do. And this is a principle of sovereignty. Now, this is okay, maybe on development. We are living with that. There is a kind of distinction which has been made between fragile countries where we cannot really be confident on the way in which the country will be managing funds, and then there is a direct control by donors, and non-fragile countries where the governance of the country is rather satisfactory, and we may be confident that they will be doing well with the money that they get. It is not clear that this model that we have for official development assistance can work with climate finance. Which means that unlike what has been done until now, and I will be finishing on this, we may need a different model, different system to manage climate finance and to make sure that climate finance will indeed get or produce result in terms of mitigation, in particular mitigation. Adaptation is not so much a problem because it is in the interest of recipient countries to do adaptation. Mitigation is a problem because economists know this problem very well. It is an issue of private provision of public goods. And private provision is always below what should be optimal. And this is the reason why what is important is the way in which the mitigation linked to climate finance is to be managed. And I believe that if we want to move on and to be effective in this area of climate finance, we have to find a way to make this climate finance effective. And this is not an easy issue, but the global community should be working on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perfect timing. We have time for questions. Frank.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Two questions. The first is on the, do we know something about how the way climate finance so far has been invested really differs from other development aid, well, the way ODA in general has been used or not? You sort of presented it as quite separate pots going to sort of separate, implicitly going to separate activities, but I wonder whether that's the case or not. And the second question is on the issue of scale that you mentioned, the 100 billion versus 1 trillion. In the slide that you showed from the OECD, there was this guarantee element that had quite apparently a relatively large leverage effect of a small amount of money that was guaranteed, and attributed private sector coming in that was large relative to the small guarantee. Is that, in your view, a way forward to increase the amount of carbon finance flows? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the question, Frank. On the first question, today, over the last couple of years, climate finance and ODA have been handled exactly in the same way. To get those charts, I worked with a data set, which are all the operations made by by bilateral agencies. It's called the Credit Reporting System. And then in that database, you have the various financing operations. Some of them are climate, have a climate label. As a matter of fact, they are using something that they call the Rio markers, with in some cases, it is the principal objective of the fund is climate. In other cases, it is significant. Climate is only significant, so that you have to put different weights on all this. So for the moment, it is exactly the same thing. And my point at the end of my presentation is to say, I'm not sure that this is the right model that we want to use if really we are more ambitious in terms of mitigation. On the second point, the problem that we have with that is that when we look at the type of operations which are behind that, this is very much financing. It is very much developed country, I mean, multilateral banks. EIB, the European Investment Bank, is in particular is very important in this area, which is financing some finance organization in developing countries, providing guarantee so that those companies in Africa, for example, are able to provide or to distribute loans to. Now, the issue there, and as a matter of fact, at some stage, I was involved in evaluating this kind of program in the EIB. The problem is that it is not clear exactly what those banks in developing countries are financing. So they may say, okay, we are trying to finance climate-related operations, but nobody is really going to look at every operation to see whether it is true that this is climate-related. So in terms of effectiveness, it is not clear that what is behind that. And so another case is when this guarantee is given to for some company to make a loan and to invest in infrastructure. But it is not the majority of this.
Please go.
Thank you very much for your presentation again. I'm very much interested in the very first graph that you displayed. Well, we can't see it now, but in this graph, you had, it seemed as if you had a very clear impact of the statement of the Millennium Goals on people's ability to gather funds to address what is, in both cases, a public good, right? Old school development is a public good, and climate change is also a public good. So I would like to get your institutional view on what is going on there. Why did we manage to increase the contribution to this public good so much after the Millennium Declaration? Is it because we had clearly stated goals that everybody could work around as a focal point? I want to alleviate poverty, access to education, mortality. Those things are vivid objectives that we can coalesce around. Is this what we're failing to achieve with climate? Or is it something else that people got disenchanted with the way those funds are used or whatever, that explains why we cannot have such a declaration that would create an impact, if this is actually what happened?
Okay, I'm not sure that I have a complete answer to your question, but I think it is certainly a very valid question. I believe that this big increase that we can observe after the Millennium Declaration is linked more to the issue of the effectiveness of ODA. In the previous period, in the 90s, it is probably at that time that there was the most important critique made in academia and in some cases by the banking sector in particular, about the ineffectiveness of ODA. And people were saying, okay, this is not doing anything. This is not contributing to any development, because this money is essentially appropriated by the elite, which is sending the money to tax haven or buying luxury goods with it, okay? And the Millennium Declaration and the Millennium Development Goals, to a large extent, was not only trying to nudge advanced countries to go back to the original level of aid, but also a view about, from now on, we will be more effective, because there are goals, because all the countries will be reporting on those goals. 2 years after the Millennium Declaration, there was this big meeting in Monterrey with developing countries, donors, multilateral banks, where they decided about the way in which they would organize the distribution of ODA. And because of that, donors were more confident that their money would be used properly. And I believe that this is the main reason why it was possible to go back to the level of ODA over GNI that we observed in the 80s, etc. Does that answer your question?
If I can. Just a small question. Compared to the, because it's striking the fact that you say that it is not additional, the aid for.
You can see it here.
You can see it. But what I would have thought is that compared to the traditional ODA, the aid that you give for fighting climate change is in your best interest, you know, because it is a public, it's a global issue. ODA, you could say, okay, just to help them develop, we don't care. Here we care. So sure. This is why I'm a bit
No, I mean, surprised. Okay. Yeah. I see your point, and as a matter of fact, in one of the slides, I was making this point. No, you're right. I mean, in that case, there is a kind of direct interest by developed countries to minimize emission in that part of the world, in the rest of the world. And because of that, we may expect those countries to be willing to contribute. More, yeah. Now, I think that we are at the beginning. I mean, the point was, there are two issues there. I mean, one issue is you need to get more money. In countries which are very constrained from a budgetary point of view. And the agencies, I don't think that I heard about any country where suddenly the development agency, like AFD in France or the FCDO in the UK, were told, oh, you can increase the total amount that you are providing because of the climate finance. I mean, all this has been completely almost under the cover. I mean, so from that point of view, we could say that I'm not sure that advanced countries took things really seriously. But on the other hand, and the distinction that I made between nominal and real is quite important, because nominally, you can probably say, yes, there is additional money. Okay? And people will not go to see what is behind that. So this is the reason why the chart that I've shown here are in real terms. It is only in real terms that you can see that there is no additionality.
Yeah, you can ask a question. The last one.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering, okay, adaptation can be a good adaptation or bad adaptation. I mean, adaptation with a big carbon footprint or not? Question mark. And development, yes, we cannot say we don't want development, but then what kind of development? Because if you take the curve, I don't know if it is correct, but I used to teach it, the Kuznets curve, which say what is the CO2 as a function of GNP.
The environment Kuznets curve.
Yeah.
Pardon?
This is the environment Kuznets curve. There is another Kuznets curve, no?
Yes. Now you may wonder, do you have to go? I speak in a kind of extreme way, but do you want to go in a situation you have no car, and then you have a car, and then when you become rich enough to say, oh, after all, should I use the car all the time? I can only use bicycle and public transport. Can you imagine a jump? Do they have to follow exactly our path, or can you break and jump directly to a situation that we think it's better on the dimension of climate change? That's my question.
The first part of your question was about development. On development and what is being done on development, I mean, this is the sustainable development goals, which are there, where you have goals in terms of health, goals in terms of education, etc., etc. So when what we call development and financing development is that part of the sustainable development goals. Now, on your question about last part of your question, which really is the question that was raised by Frank in the morning. You are talking about what is a development path, what is a climate friendly or climate change friendly development path in the country. And it is certainly not clear that the development path is to go through the same steps as developed countries went in the past, and but maybe faster. Certainly, you have to skip some of those steps. And I believe that this is something that is going on. The technology helps a lot. For example, the fact that the phone, what is permitted by the fact that most people in developing countries use smartphones, is making a big difference on many things. For example, the fact that the farmer may know exactly what will be the price of the crop that is growing, whether it has to go to the market or not. All these things, whether it can look at the weather forecast, all these things are changing the way in which some production processes take place. So yes, I believe that there will be, the path will not be the same as it was the case in Europe. But this is very much linked to innovation. And for example, in a developing country, if they have to build a power, if they have to develop power, they will not probably use coal, but today they will probably not use oil. They will probably use gas, knowing that gas is much less polluting than the others. So this means that with respect to advanced countries, they already saved on 2 steps. And in the climate finance may be financing new solar plants, which are not substituting to old power stations, which are simply the new power plants are solar rather than gas. This is not saving on emission. Or this is saving on emission, this is what I was saying in the morning, saving on the emission that would have been observed in the old days with the old technology. And this is part of climate finance. So I believe that the path is certainly not the same, and this is taken into account.